Hi, I'm Michelle, and today's lecture is going to be about capitalism and the rise of private prisons. Go ahead and get this screen shared. Okay. Okay. So we're going to talk about capitalism and the rise of private prisons. So first we have to ask, first we have this quote from Adam Smith. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker they would expect our dinner, but from the regard to their own interest. It's kind of the idea that capitalists have that profit is the biggest motivator for goods and services, not kind of goodness out of someone's own heart. We'll kind of talk about what exactly is capitalism. Well, it's an economic system that involves the private ownership of goods, typically by companies, as opposed to common ownership by the people who produce those goods. So kind of break that down. What are the components of that? First, you kind of have private ownership that's obvious. Corporations are owned by a single person. The goods that are produced don't belong to the individual worker, which leads you into wage labor. Wage labor functionally means that a worker sells their labor as opposed to the goods directly to people under a contract. Any goods they produce during that labor is then owned by the employer. The next kind of piece of the puzzle is capital accumulation, and this is the drive to profit, to always build up more profit. It's the very foundation of capitalism, the making money part of it. Next part is kind of no government regulation, or like laissez-faire means to let do. Governments don't have a lot of regulations in a capitalist society on businesses. The idea is that the free market kind of regulates prices, what wages can be, all these kind of things that supposedly the free market would handle. We might talk about how that's not true going forward. It's kind of the history of capitalism. First, it arose out of the feudal system, which was a hierarchical system that involved poor people farming land, and they gave portions of that produce to lords or land masters in return to both property and military protection. The society is characterized as being mostly agrarian, meaning like agriculture. It was an incredibly exploitative system that existed around the 12th to the 15th century. These systems were typically what we'd call closed economies. There were often restrictions on trade and imports and exports with other communities. There are some small forms of trades within it, surplus goods produced on the farm that were not had to be given over to the landowner, but that were quite localized. It was just about building local economies. But that kind of started to build up over time, and industry were organized in what they called guilds, which functionally had the production carried out by a skilled craftsman and their family. Well, the fall of feudalism kind of was triggered by a couple things, including the Black Plague, but foreign trade started to increase within communities, which that kind of trade built up and allowed an emergence to be a wealthy merchant class within these feudal systems. The boom in trade then allowed many European countries to get rich from taxing those merchants, turn the countries provide protection and ensure global market domination and access to trade routes. This is what would set the stage for imperialism and colonialism in the 17th century. This is when capitalism really started to become this kind of fully fledged economic system. It started with what were known as cottage industry in England, which were functionally single people homes that were turned into small factories. A family would have a house, they would get products, they'd make things, they'd then sell it. Over time, people began to realize that if you moved production from multiple people being under one roof, that not only minimized cost, but also maximized profit. They realized if you had everyone there, you wouldn't have to ship out product to those individual cottage industries. They also found they had greater level of control to measure the kind of productivity and output on the workers, which started leading into kind of wage labor and the rise of the modern day factory. And the rise of industrialization really made that happen. The cotton industry was kind of one of the first to really see how the Industrial Revolution took shape. There were less restrictions on it, which helped it rise even further along. They were able to use different technology and innovation And then this was further pushed along once the steam engine was invented, and it was off to the races, and capitalism was able to really begin the process of globalization, which we kind of see now. Increased global trade was empowered by the plundering of Africa for resources and slave labor. But now we're kind of in like a period of neoliberalism that we'll see the deregulation of the privatization of goods, which runs public, and government policies generally work to protect the businesses instead of the working class. So that's kind of how it's built up now. But there's plenty of issues with capitalism that kind of can lend themselves into the prisons problem. First, it creates constant economic crisis. '08 is probably a good example of this. There's an economic recession caused by banks and the foreclosures of homes because banks would give out loans that people could pay back, and they did that knowingly. So economy crashes in '08. The government then decides to bail the banks out and allow them to continue doing predatory policies that only lead to further economic problems later down the road, kind of recreates itself. You see it now with Corona. Look at the milk industry, all these different agricultural industries that are creating surplus production, but because the workers can't afford the goods, and it's so reliant on this heavily capitalist system that no one's able to afford those goods, and it's causing whole industries to dry up. The milk industry has had to dump plenty of milk because there's just no longer a supply chain or people to afford those products, which is causing a lot of issues. And when it comes to that economic crisis, because of globalization and the increased interconnectedness of countries and markets, that means small recessions no longer stay localized. They then bloom and they cause cascading effects and cause every other market to kind of see that problem. Then you have environmental degradation. That surplus production that we kind of talked about has to come from somewhere. There's an idea capitalism always wants to produce more and more and more to make more profit. But like we talked about, if there's no one to buy those products, then we're just mining and using and extracting, and there are limits to what we extract called we're at peak for some things. Peak oil is a phrase you may have heard of that basically indicates there's a limited amount of resources and we're hitting that limit. And this is causing environmental degradation. You see ocean acidification, GHG emissions, dumping. We use a boatload of water for agriculture, habitat destruction. You think of cheap energy to kind of fuel consumption, oil extraction, coal, and they're awful for the environment, and it's all driven by capitalist drive for profit and consumption. It also causes poverty. The deregulation of the economy gives full control to capitalists to set the stage. There's a reason we had huge fights for minimum wage laws, for the 40-hour work week, why unions are really important, because without that, the capitalist will obviously be incentivized to maximize profit and do that at the expense of the worker. Without minimum wage laws, they would just charge as little as they would pay as little as possible to maximize their profits. And we kind of see that now when they're fighting against minimum wage laws being raised, and all of the money is going to shareholders as opposed to the people that produce for that company. Next, you have war. I kind of already touched on this a little bit over about how imperialism and colonialism were tools capitalism used to produce. And constant crisis is inevitable under this. We needed to go and think the Middle East crisis is a war over oil. They said it wasn't, but it's functionally when they nationalized the oil industry, the United States was obviously not happy about that, so they had to find a way to kind of intervene and influence with our capitalist system. Think the Cold War was literally a fight between capitalists and the Soviet Union. All these instances where violence is necessitated for the drive for profit. Next, we have dehumanization. You kind of think about it creates effective caste systems. Their organization, these hierarchies of the poor and the rich, the kind of bourgeoisie or the proletariat, as communists would talk about, where we all kind of became cogs in the capitalist machine, or we become wage slaves. It's all about the amount we can produce, the amount of productivity. And this leads to certain bodies and certain identities being labeled as not as productive, or only being productive insofar as there's cheap labor. Slavery is an example of that kind of cheap labor. It can work to explain patriarchy, and that women are reduced to being only beneficial insofar as they produce new humans for capitalism and new consumers. And that links into like sexuality stuff, where queer folks are quote unquote not productive, or disability, they're not as productive to society. So all these kind of instances of dehumanization. Next, we kind of are going to dive into capitalism and prisons before we get into the private prison start more generally. So carceral capitalism is kind of a term that's been used to describe the role that capitalism plays in using and funding prisons, and how punishment is then used to prevent the deviation from capitalism. Crime ends up being defined in terms that most benefit the ability for accumulation to continue unimpeded, for profit accumulation. And you can kind of think of that on this topic through weed legalization. Weed was criminalized because it was seen as something that Black people and brown people used, and it was demonized. And the kind of marijuana industry nowadays, if you look at it, even certain Republican senators have seen that it is profitable, so they started backing the legalization of marijuana. And oftentimes, the only people who can get licenses in states where it's been legalized are people who are not felons, and people who were arrested most likely for weed use were obviously Black people because of racist policing practices and racist sentencing laws. So they were less likely to be able to get the permits to be able to then go create legal marijuana businesses. So it's only white people who then get to benefit from that. And there's still a Black market then that can then be criminalized to then still incarcerate Black and brown people. The rise of prisons as a site of capitalism can really be seen at its fullest in the 1960s, and kind of paralleled now with protest. But the Black working class began to rise up against capitalism, which was in turn met with massive amounts of police brutality and state crackdowns within the prisons. So it was used to kind of punish those that deviated, like I talked about. So prisons then no longer kind of became about rehabilitation, even though they never really were. But work then became a tool to maintain submission by the prisoners. It is literally one of the few things you are allowed to do besides sit around in a cell with literally nothing to entertain you or to kind of quote unquote rehabilitate you. So it's seen as a reward for doing, like, for having good behavior, or at least what the prison would deem quote unquote good behavior. So this allowed entire industries to thrive within the prison system, such as clothing industries. All the while, public funds were being diverted from education and welfare programs to the carceral state. More ways that capitalism continued to lead to the kind of dehumanization and increased levels of poverty amongst those the most vulnerable in society. Not only that, but if you are in prison, it then becomes much more difficult once you get out to get a job. A lot of places won't hire felons or people so they can't get jobs, which then leads them to go back into things like selling illegal drugs in the Black market, which then leads them to go to prison again and creates a never-ending cycle. They can't afford housing when they get out. They might not have adequate support systems. So that's another way that capitalism kind of recreates a lower caste almost, using the prisons. So now we'll dive into the history of private prisons. They can be dated back to pre-Civil War. Louisiana first privatized a penitentiary in 1844, and they used prison labor to produce cheap clothes for slaves. Texas also opened one around that period, and after 5 years, it was the main southern supplier of textiles west of Mississippi, which just shows you how historically private prisons have driven industries, and capitalism has dug its claws into it. Privatization started to soar after the Civil War with the practice of what is known as convict leasing. In many states, they claimed to be incapable of being able to afford to house all of the prisoners it had, so it turned to privatization, which they functionally leased prisoners out to private companies. In fact, many southern plantations literally just converted to private prisons. With the adage of the 13th Amendment, it made slavery legal as a form of punishment because of a crime. So this kind of propped up the capitalization of industry, such as U.S. Steel, which was the world's first billion-dollar company, used prison labor in its coal mines. Lessees would then give a cut of the profits to the state, which ensured it would endure. Between 1880 and 1904 in Alabama, profits from leasing literally made up 10% of its budget. And bear in mind, the conditions in convict leasing were awful. Some people would argue they were worse than slavery itself. In an effort to maximize profit, they kept them in slave-like conditions and had literally no worker safety. Death rates were incredibly high in convict leasing. For prisoners that were leased to railroad companies between 1877 and 1879, they reached as high as 45% death rates in North Carolina, and there are similar rates in other states. And they had awful conditions, terrible. And although states got jealous of the huge amount of profits that lessees were seeing, so they turned away from that model back to kind of the public model we see today. Of course, private prisons still exist and can trace their roots to the system. Core Civics, which is, we'll talk about a little bit more, is a huge private prison company. Its founder ran a cotton plantation in the size of Manhattan, all the way up until 1967. Modern day private prisons are not much better. They often have fewer COs than public prison, and they typically have less training time. Violence also occurs way more frequently in private prisons. Studies have found assaults can happen at double the rates than at public prisons. Reports show that guards often deny medical care. They often sexually assault prisoners. They're oftentimes found not achieving their stated goal of making imprisonment cheaper either, which was their justifications all along. The U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics found in 2016 that they've not actually created any cost savings. So what do they kind of look like today? We already know the U.S. has the world's largest prison population, but we do also have the world's largest private prison population. As of 2020, there are currently around 171,000 inmates held in private prisons, which is less than 8% of the country's total prison population, though the percentage changed drastically when discussing immigration. During the Obama administration, moves were taken to decrease the private prison population, but as is no surprise, Trump and Jeff Sessions just reversed those moves and began to increase use of private prisons again. Even though they're a small portion of our population, of our prison system, privatization can still be used in public prisons through things like the privatization of food services. There are a few dominant prison companies. Core Civic, I've mentioned already. GEO Group, which is huge in immigration detention, and Management and Training Corporation are three big ones. But there's roughly around 4,000 total companies involved within the legal system. Now, they're incredibly pervasive because of how much they donate heavily to political campaigns. In 2016, Core Civic and GEO both donated $250,000 each to Trump. They donate heavily to predominantly Republican candidates and lobby for policies which would increase incarceration because Avi.gov. They also subsidize neutral researchers who are pressured to produce results consistent with what private prisons would want, which just shows how deeply capitalism has kind of ingrained their way into our public policies to maintain their grasp on it. Now, there's a huge connection to immigration. The number of immigrants being held in privately run facilities has increased tremendously over time, from around 5,000 in 2002 to around 26,000 in 2017. Trump has obviously continued to push for an increase in private prison use for immigrants, pushing for increased funding and more detention centers, which are operated by those same companies we already talked about. These private immigration detention centers are plagued with the same problems we've already talked about. They never get good, obviously. They have slave labor, poor conditions, and high death rates. So as you can kind of see, private prisons reflect both capitalism within the industry, but also kind of act as a tool for capitalism to prop itself up. And that was my lecture. Let me know if you have any questions.